Hey everybody, it's Lavender Town, and today I am making monster designs based on different plagues and pandemics because you guys probably know this already, but we're in the middle of a pandemic and honestly it was all I could think about. I wanted to start off with tuberculosis. It's also known as the White Plague or consumption, and it's an interesting disease because it was known in the 19th century as a romantic disease. Lord Byron even said that he would like to die of consumption, which is well, it's certainly a thing to say. Basically, tuberculosis is a very dramatic disease. It causes the sufferer to become very pale and cough up blood, and it mostly affects the lungs, particularly in media and stuff because it's very dramatic to have your character coughing up blood. So for this monster design, I really wanted to focus on the features of the disease that are most emblematic of it. One of the reasons it's called consumption is because it made the sufferer very, very thin. So it was like the disease was consuming them. So I made her like extremely excessively thin. I wanted her to kind of look like an old god. That was sort of the like inspiration for the monster element of this. I decided to go for an old god or goddess sort of motif because this disease is so very old. We found evidence of tuberculosis in the spines of mummies, even going back as far as 9,000 years. We've found remains of people who had tuberculosis, so it's an extremely old disease. It's really hung around for a long time. I decided that I was going to do these sort of antlers on her head because I thought it made her look more like celestial, and I did them in the shape of the like veins in the lung. I thought that would be another good sort of like reference point for this type of disease. And I tried to use the motif of lungs all over the design, so I tried to make both her sleeves, the like top of her dress, and even the like panels at the bottom of the dress all sort of have this lung-like shape because tuberculosis is known so much for causing damage and bleeding in the lungs. I had this pattern over her mouth, kind of like a birthmark that I wanted to kind of look like she coughed up blood, but I ended up deciding it looked a little too gross, especially once I actually made it like bright red. I tried to mess around with it and make it work, but everything I was doing was making it even more disgusting looking. And while I want her to be really scary, I thought it was a bit too much, and it kind of looked like it was supposed to be real blood when I was trying to make it more like a pattern or a marking on her face. So I did end up editing it and changing it to make it a little more pattern-like and a little less gory looking. I didn't want her to actually be like too scary for YouTube. But overall I think she turned out really well. I also did this sort of like markings on her hands because I thought it also worked really well with this sort of like narrative of someone coughing dramatically into their hand and then seeing blood and knowing that their days are numbered. The disease was almost completely eliminated in the 80s, but right as it was about to completely disappear, drug-resistant strains of the disease, likely caused by people not finishing their medication, started to arise and the cases went way up again. So it's a disease that still has not been completely eradicated. Next up is another terrifying and ancient disease, and for this one I decided to go with the monster of the siren or the mermaid because cholera is waterborne. Cholera has always affected the poor more than it's affected the rich, though it has killed a few kings because cholera is mainly found in the water of poor communities where sanitation is not that accessible. It causes horrible dehydration and basically just like sucks all the water out of somebody very shortly after they get the disease. And it can be stored in the wells of communities that aren't able to keep their water particularly clean. This is why clean water is so important because the diseases that pop up in dirty water are really serious and can kill people in very short periods of time. It causes wrinkled hands and skin and sunken eyes because basically it just really quickly dehydrates you, and obviously one of the most important things other than oxygen that humans need to survive is water, so it's a very serious disease. I wanted to make her look extremely deadly and like she might be kind of quick and very like alert because cholera, while it does have only a 1% mortality rate if someone is given treatment right away, certain variants of it can kill in only 2 hours. So I really wanted to impress that this is a disease that like strikes hard and fast, unlike some diseases like tuberculosis, which usually really take their time and are harder to treat, but definitely give people more time, whereas cholera is just so incredibly quick, especially in an area where someone's having trouble getting clean water. I decided to just give her some like goopy, liquidy looking parts of her design. I was kind of torn because this is really a disease of two different opposing factors, one of which is that it lives in water, and it really has to do with drinking water that is not clean, but also because it dehydrates the victim so dramatically. So I wasn't really sure whether I should go with like a sort of like plump, more like flowy, liquidy look for this character, or more of like the sucked in, dehydrated look of the victims. I decided to sort of go for both in different places. I kept the sort of wrinkled, dying hands, and I also gave her like this grayish blue skin color because people who are affected with cholera, their skin can actually start to look sort of bluish. I also just wanted to do sort of like this sickly green tint over all of her, particularly because cholera is really spread by sewage getting into the water, and it is why like cholera used to affect basically every part of the world. There have actually been 7 recorded pandemics of cholera, which is pretty dramatic, and it really only started to get cut down because certain countries like enforcing via the government chlorination and filtration for the water systems. It is really the only thing that has massively cut down cholera in developed nations. She was looking very samey color palette wise, so I decided to put these 2 like weird little tattoos on her that are in the symbol of the quarantine flag people used to fly when someone was on a ship with cholera, so that the harbor would know to quarantine the ship for up to 30 to 40 days. Next up is probably the most infamous plague of all time, and that is the Black Death. The Black Death was caused by a disease called the bubonic plague, and basically it caused all sorts of completely horrifying symptoms. It would cause necrosis in the fingertips, basically all of the extremities, so the toes, the nose, different parts of the face. And necrosis is basically when your skin just sort of dies. It turns black and just stops working properly. Blood isn't flowing through that skin anymore, and it looks pretty horrifying. It's sort of zombie-like. It also causes some spitting up of blood, and also like these buboes all over people's body, which is what the bubonic part of the plague is referring to. It's basically like this gross growth kind of tumory thing that shows up on people, and it was one of the first ways that you could tell that someone was getting the bubonic plague. It took out between 30% and 60% of the European population, which is a pretty insane death rate, and it's really associated with rats, though it's actually the fleas that were on the rats that were really spreading the disease. In fact, when the rats would die, that is when the fleas would jump on to their new human hosts, and some people think that the whole plague started because of climate change at the time. The warming of the environment was causing the rats to go in from the marshlands into like human spaces, and that's how the fleas got into so many human populations. One of the reasons that this plague was so bad is that medical science had kind of stagnated, and a lot of people sort of believed in more of like a spiritual or religious understanding of how illnesses happened. So there was one of the experts at the time was saying that this was all happening because of the alignment of some planets. Other people used it as an opportunity to persecute Jewish people because they blamed it on them, and generally a lot of people believed it was just due to bad air. So that's actually why plague doctors had that big weird scary like bird face mask. They would pack all sorts of like smelly stuff in the front of that, and they believed that if they smelled like random strong smelling stinky stuff that the bad air couldn't get in. There were some accidental successes as far as preventing the Black Death. There were priests who would burn and basically make a lot of smoke, and that actually would kind of help with some of the airborne transmission of this disease. But in general, the real perpetrator for how it was spreading was through these fleas, and the fact that people didn't know that really left them completely helpless to the continued spread of the disease. This disease is dramatic and extremely deadly, and it still does exist in some form today, though with antibiotics the death rate is only around 11%. But still, I find the Black Death to be an incredibly scary event in human history, and an incredibly scary disease in general. I hope you guys enjoyed watching me design these plague monsters. I haven't drawn anything creepy in a long time, and I thought it was kind of appropriate considering everything that's going on right now. I really couldn't even think of anything else because my mind has been completely consumed by worries about the pandemic. But I hope you guys are doing well, and if you get to stay home from work or school, I hope you're enjoying that. Thank you so much for watching, and stay safe out there, you guys. Thank you to all of my patrons, including Bald-Headed Potato, Bella Story, Best Kaiju, Braggy, Compopon, Lion, Clockwork Construct, Joe, Dr. Casket, Ilaria Louie, Greer the Animator, Griffix, Hachiubi, Ice Cream Pal, Ivan Rodriguez, JJJ, Joseph Copel, Libla, Marina Costa, Micah Dactyl, Mr. Dr. Pence, Nicolette Queen, Nora Cornelison, Ruined Rain Crow, Some Mediocre Artist, The Artsy Moose, Throat Foam, XAM, and Your Boy ST.